Israel just took a shocking step. The Knesset passed the first reading of a bill to impose the death penalty on convicted terrorists. No appeals, no judicial discretion. Netanyahu backs it. The timing? Just after the return from Gaza of the body of Hadar Goldin after 11 years in Hamas captivity, and with Iran threatening a surprise attack. Security experts are warning that this law could backfire. Will it deter terror or ignite more legislative and diplomatic division? Dreaming of Jerusalem? Now's your chance to make it real. Enter the Dream Raffle for a $1.2 million luxury apartment in the heart of Israel's capital. Enter by November 17th for a bonus chance to win $15,000 in cash. Click the link in the description and buy your tickets today.
Hi, Shalom. I'm Mark Regev, and we're here today for another edition of Israel Undiplomatic. And as per usual, I'm here with my co-host, Ruthie Blum. How are we today, Ruthie?
I'm good, Mark, but we got to get right to some touchy topics here. Let's begin with the Knesset bill. It passed its first reading to impose the death penalty on terrorists. And by the way, mandatory death penalty. And as it happens, it's only the first reading and it needs 2 more readings, etc. So it could be that this is more symbolic than technical, or it's possible, for example, that the Supreme Court will not allow it, etc. But the reason that it's happening now is that Israel was waiting for all the live hostages to be home and for at least most of the dead bodies to be returned before taking any such steps, for fear that it would endanger the hostages.
So let's analyze this issue. First of all, in Israel, we have the death penalty theoretically on the books, but since 1962, it has not been used, and it wasn't used before 1962 either. In all of Israel's history, since 1948, once we became an independent country, the death penalty has been used only once, and that was for Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann. And he is, he's out there alone, and he was, put to death, and his ashes were scattered across the Mediterranean, so his grave wouldn't be a place where neo-Nazis would come and, have parties and things. But Israel has, we don't do death, not for rapists and not for murderers. And with that, we're sort of in the Western consensus. Most Western democracies don't today have a death penalty. The United States, a very important Western democracy, is the only one that has a death penalty.
And not in all states.
Not in all states, and it remains controversial in the United States. It's an issue of debate. So in Israel, like Eichmann, there wasn't a debate. That was clear. This Nazi war criminal, the guy responsible for the murder of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Jews, should have been put to death. The issue of terrorism has been part of the political debate in Israel. Do we put terrorists, death penalty for terrorists, people guilty of gruesome crimes, should they be put to death? It's been part of the political debate in Israel for years now, for almost as long as I can remember. Is it finally serious this time? I'm not sure, Ruthie.
Well, the issue of the death penalty, when you talk about it in other countries, we know the dilemmas about it. The main one being, I think, aside from, we shouldn't play God or we shouldn't take revenge, we shouldn't behave the way the killers behave, etc. The other argument is, look, we know of people who were executed in the United States, for example, who later it turned out because of DNA testing and new evidence that the person was wrongly executed. And that's awful. And there are many people who say, better to let convicted criminals, either be free or be in jail than kill even one innocent person.
I think it's in the Talmud, actually. It's a Jewish thing.
Right. But in Israel, the tricky part is this, and I had my own debates about it, because there are, aside from everything else, death row in the United States. This I know because I watch a lot of true crime documentaries in order to relax. That death row is a much cushier prison sentence than the general population, where criminals are very violent and there's a lot of, rapes and horrible stuff that goes on. Whereas death row has better food, has better conditions, and also because of stays of execution and appeals. Sometimes someone is on death row for years and years before being executed, and sometimes dies before he's even executed. In Israel, there's a big difference, and that is that over the years, we have made the dreadful error of freeing terrorists from jails in exchanges for innocent hostages. I mean, our issue with the enemy is that they know that if they kidnap an Israeli, we'll do anything to get him or her back. And releasing terrorists from Israeli prisons is one way to do it. And before October 7th, one thing we know is like the famous case of the something like 1,100 terrorists released in the Gilad Shalit deal. Gilad Shalit was taken prisoner in Gaza. He was there for 5 years. And finally, after much, much public pressure, Israel released something like 1,100 terrorists. But among those was Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind of the October 7th massacre. And before that, he had been diagnosed with a brain tumor in Israel, and Israeli doctors in prison cured him of it and then released him. So, many, many Israelis who opposed the death penalty altogether, not just for terrorists, but in general, who have an aversion to the death penalty, said, well, as long as they're in jails, somehow the government is tempted to give in to demands, ransom demands, and this is a big problem.
So on the moral issue, I don't think I have too many qualms about death penalty for murderers and rapists and people who've done horrendous crimes. Obviously, there has to be due process. Obviously, there has to be, a total, all the evidence has to be there, right? There can be not even the slightest doubt that the person is guilty of the crime. It has to go all the way up to the appeal to the Supreme Court, all that. Having said that, the proponents of the death penalty say not only is it justice and real justice, but they also say, from a utilitarian point of view, it will help because it will deter terrorists from killing innocent people. And I think there are questions about that. First of all, when a terrorist does a terrorist act, let's say you walk into a supermarket with a machine gun and randomly kill people, or you walk into a coffee shop with a knife and start killing people. I mean, you're taking a very big risk with your own life as well. And so is the death penalty really a deterrent? Even there are some people who kill themselves deliberately, the famous suicide bombers, right? And so if you believe that in dying, you expect to die anyway, is it in any way a deterrent? And I think that's a serious question. What is the deterrent capability of the death penalty? Is it actually going to save lives? And I think there's a whole question mark there with the type of terrorists we've been dealing with and the type of people this is supposed to deter. The security services have argued for years that actually that's not a successful deterrent. What is a successful deterrent, but also another controversial Israeli policy, is like house demolitions afterwards. If people think that their loved ones are going to suffer because of their act, right? If their parents' home is going to be closed or something like that, that actually does work as a successful deterrent. But then when Israel is accused, of course, of these people weren't involved in the crime, they just happened to be relatives of, and so forth. And the Supreme Court has ruled on when you can and can't do housing demolitions. But nevertheless, the security services says that actually works for a deterrent because maybe the suicide bomber or the terrorist is willing to kill themselves for what they think is the greater good, but for the greater terror, yes, for their crazy extreme agenda, yes. But they don't want to see the members of their family hurt. And so the issue here, can you really deter someone who wants to be a suicide bomber, someone who is willing to die for their cause with the threat of a death penalty? And I think it's an open question, and I'm actually doubtful.
No, see, I agree with you. I don't think it's so much a deterrent because, but neither the home demolitions, for example, you say they're worried about their loved ones, but the Palestinian Authority takes care of that. by funding terrorists and their families for life. Okay, stipends with money that they have never been able to earn on their own. So it's not clear whether it's a deterrent. But then the question is, again, whether or not it deters them. What it does is prevent us from having terrorists in jails to use as barter. That it does do. It's not a question of deterring the terrorists. First of all, if you believe in jihad against the Jews and Christians and infidel Muslims, why would anything deter you? If you believe that you're a martyr for Allah, why would that deter you? Now, we know that even extremists and even people would-be martyrs, many of them have to be given ecstasy pills and things like that to go on their missions, because there is a human instinct not to be afraid of death. Okay, it's not as though... plus, the people who dispatch those terrorists, they certainly want to live. We know that, the heads of all of these terrorist organizations, they are millionaires and billionaires, and they live it up. At the time of Arafat's death, which was 21 years ago, I believe, today, he was worth some $1 billion. All right, so they send others to kill themselves. So it's true that death is frightening. Also, I think whether or not the final death is frightening to people who believe that they're going to have virgins in paradise or whatever, it's pain. All people are afraid of pain. And so getting killed is scary. You might be in, just the idea that you're going to get shot or blown up or something is frightening. But the point is, this is supposed to be a deterrent, unfortunately, a deterrent for Israel not to be tempted to go through this business of releasing terrorists.
So I want to refer to a few things, but on that last point, I'm not sure it's a real issue. Okay, why? Because we'll always have, unfortunately, as long as this conflict continues and we face a terrorist problem, we're always going to have terrorists in jail who are not death penalty people. People who are raising money for terrorists, you're not going to kill them, I presume. People who are educating for terrorism, people who are recruiting terrorists. The person who drives the terrorist to do his murder, is he going to get the death penalty? I doubt it. So you're always going to have a lot of Hamas people in jail who anyway will provide motivation for people on the terror side to kidnap and do other bad things. And so I'm not sure having the death penalty for the few who are the gruesome killers who themselves cut off heads and raped and burned people alive, the people who would probably be liable for the death penalty, they're a minority of this group, right? And so I'm not sure that solves the problem. You raise very rightly the PA, which obviously gives all sorts of financial incentives to the families of terrorists. Yes, they're set for life almost economically in the pay-to-slay issue. And that was recognized by the United States Congress when they did the Taylor Force Act, because they said, if you're funding terrorism, we're not going to fund you, right? And I think that's well known. But I think there's another issue. It's not just the money. If you live in a society and your son is a shaheed, he's a terrorist who died fighting the Jews, doesn't matter that he killed 12 innocent people in the process, he's still a hero, yes? Your family status goes up. It's not just the money, yes? Your social status from being an anonymous Palestinian family, you are heroes to the national cause in the eyes of the Palestinian Authority. And that's something that's very difficult, I think, to take away. On the issue of due process, there's also a situation where, because you have to do due process, first of all, these people will be in Israeli jails for a long time before they're actually executed, because they'll have to go up, as I said before, to the Supreme Court. And when you've got people, let's say, on death row in Israel, at the moment we've got no one on death row, does that provide additional motivation for terrorists to try to take hostages, to do things, to get people released before they're executed? And so I'm of the opinion, in Israeli, we like to talk a lot. We're Jews. We're very verbal. Our politicians especially so. But maybe is this really going to happen, or this is just a lot of haraya? Though if you look at polling, it has strong support. A majority of Israelis believe a death penalty for terrorists. But those who've thought the issue through, and you have to ask, will this help? I think that's the bottom question. That's the ultimate, will this help? And I think that it's an open question. I don't think it's clear at all.
So here's the the question about this, and then we can talk about an interesting case of 200 Hamas terrorists in a tunnel in Rafah, and we'll get to that in a second. Is it always whether we're deterring something or whether it'll help? Maybe there's such a thing as punishment for a crime, that punishment that has to fit a crime. You know, there is something to be said for that as well. And I'll tell you, we know if we leave off terrorism for a minute, think of serial killers, think of Israelis there are these crimes that are so horrific, or against children, all kinds of horrific crimes. And we've seen also a huge spike in the slaughter of wives at the hands of their husbands in Israel. It's not that there are that many, but it's a huge spike in it. And when it started during the pandemic and during the war, it's horrific murders of wives at the hands of their husbands. You know, if you were that woman's family, would you mind? Good, put him to death. He deserves it. I mean, the thing is, there is also an instinct to say, you know what, there's a limit to what we can tolerate as a society. So I know revenge, I would assume that you're not somebody who thinks that we should, I would say, enact laws that have to do with revenge. But you know, there's a point at which after October 7th, when you say Israel, this is popular among Israelis, that's why. And it's a natural instinct to say, you know what? The barbarity, the cruelty, and why should that person be allowed to live? Now, that's why I want to get to these 200 Hamas.
Before we move on to the 200,
yes,
I just want to respond.
Yes.
You talk about punishment, and you're 100% correct, right? And one of the frustrating things for Israelis is people are sentenced to life, sentences in jail for horrendous crimes because we don't use the death penalty, and then they get out. And people find that very frustrating. They get out in these prison releases. And so, you know, a life sentence isn't really a life sentence. It's only a matter of time before there's another deal, right? And that's where a lot of this is coming from. It's a response to all the releases. And people say, well, someone's punishment should be final, right? And they shouldn't, a life sentence shouldn't mean 5 years before the next terror, you know, and it's an issue. I understand that. But I would also ask the following. Okay, terrorism is particularly gruesome, okay? But rape is particularly gruesome. Killing of children is particularly gruesome. Murder is all these things, right? It's all. And so, are you going to single these people out because they're terrorists? And if you do, okay, you theoretically can. You can make a law. But then I'll ask you the following question: we've had a few isolated incidents over the years of Jews being involved in terrorist violence against Arabs. There was one famous case in the village of Duma. What was that in the early years of this century? No, I'm trying to think when it was. Maybe it was 2010, 2011. I don't remember the date, but it was around then. Do we put Jewish boys who are involved in terrorism to death as well? Because if you make a law, the law has to be colorblind. The law has to be equal. Everyone has to be equal before the law. If you have Jewish vigilantes involved in terrorist and acts of murder, does that mean that they also need to be put to death?
But that's why I'd like to know why we need a separate law for terrorists. If you were a murderer, a terrorist is a murderer. You just said yourself that it's not enough if you drove the getaway car or you dispatched a terrorist, though I would be happy to do away with those as well. But what I'm saying is this. We have had, there was a horrific crime many years ago in Israel. I won't even bring it up, but it involved a serious newscaster celebrity and his wife. So she was quite young when she committed this disgusting crime. And by the way, it wasn't even, she admitted it. It's not like a case of mistaken identity. And life sentence is 20 years in Israel. So she got out of prison when she was still young. She's younger than I am now. So why should she be allowed to have a life from middle age? And, you know, especially now when people live to ripe old ages. I was horrified by that. And so what I'm saying is, no, I agree with you. If somebody commits a vile murder, and first-degree murder in particular, I don't see why he or she should be treated differently from a terrorist who commits a vile murder. But okay, that's where the argument goes in, or whether we play God and all of that. But
I just, before we move on to other issues, I just want to say something for all our viewers and listeners to our podcast. They shouldn't get the wrong impression about Israel. Actually, violent crime in Israel compared to other Western countries is actually very, very low. when it happens, we're all engrossed and engaged because it's rare in Israel. It's actually safer to live in Israel than in most Western countries from the point of view of murder and violent crime and so forth. When we have manifestations of it, obviously it's very, very bad. But I still believe it's safer to live in Israel than it is in the United States or Australia or most.
Well, what we don't have, it's interesting, we don't have school shootings, for example.
Yep.
It just, I mean, I don't want to arouse the evil eye here, but we don't. I mean, America has had several school shootings and crazy. We haven't had that. But here's the thing. Let's just talk about these 200 terrorists, Hamas terrorists, in a tunnel, a Hamas tunnel, a terror tunnel that they built, okay? And they're reportedly stuck in the tunnel, okay? Poor old terrorists who built a tunnel and starved and chained hostages. Now 200 of them are stuck in a tunnel of their own making.
On our side, you have to...
On our side, now. So the question is, what do we do with them? Now, as part of President Trump's 20-point plan, the first phase is that all the hostages have to be returned to Israel. Now, there are still 4 dead bodies held by Hamas. Haven't been read. But the second phase is demilitarization of Gaza and mainly disarming Hamas. Now, those terrorists in that tunnel have weapons. And by the way, they also have food. So there are people who are saying, you know what? Good, let them run out of food. They have food for, I don't know, a year, 2 years maybe, because they were hoarding food. But in any case, whether or not, what do we care what happens to them? Some people say, let's just kill them because in the last weeks of the war, the IDF was forced to fire on terrorists who suddenly popped up from tunnel shafts and shot RPGs at them.
Not just in the last week of the war. Since the ceasefire, we've
That's what
the Israeli soldiers.
Yes.
Since the ceasefire.
The ceasefire, exactly. So there's this whole discussion about what to do about them. And the Trump administration, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner came on a quick visit here to discuss what do we do with those 200 terrorists. So it was decided, okay, there was a rumor that Netanyahu denied that we got Hadar Goldin, who had been held for 11 years in Gaza, his dead body. It was during the ceasefire in the 2014 war. There was a ceasefire, and he was killed after the ceasefire went into effect, and his body was dragged into Gaza and kept there for 11 years. And he was just brought back this week and buried. And there was an idea that somehow maybe we agreed to release those 200 terrorists in the tunnel in order to get Hadar Goldin back. And Netanyahu said that didn't happen. And so far, those terrorists are still in the tunnel. But here's the catch. As usual, thank you very much, the Arab world around us that is supposedly, in on the Abraham Accords or trying to be part of it. Nobody wants them. So if it's like this, if we let them out of the tunnel, that we said they have to come with their arms up and their weapons down, and they're not doing that. The other thing is, why don't we just bomb them, kill them all? We're not doing that. Obviously, we're not going to do that. We don't, because Israel doesn't do that, but also the international community would call us murderers, etc. So that's not an option. That's not an option. So the only option was, okay, they disarm, they surrender, and if they do that, they will be allowed to move out of Gaza, move elsewhere to another country. They'll be spared. Guess what? Nobody wants them. Surprise, surprise. Why should anybody want them? And let me just tell you something. If those terrorists had been on Egypt, we have seen Egypt over the years flood the tunnels. Nobody cared when Egypt said, no Hamas in our borders, no Gaza, no woman, child, nobody from Gaza in our borders. Nobody wants them. So again, Israel is under the microscope for how to deal with these murderers, torturers, and starvers of the hostages over these last 2 years.
So the Hamas is saying that they can leave the tunnel, they'll leave unarmed, but they'll go straight to Hamas-controlled territory in Gaza, and they'll rearm and they'll be part of Hamas's army. That's what Hamas is basically saying. But we should let them out alive without their weapons and allow them once again to rejoin the Hamas network. And there's no shortage of arms, unfortunately, still in Hamas-controlled territory, and they could do that. And Israel, I think, has to play our cards very carefully here. And obviously, we're no longer in government, and we are basing everything we're saying on press reports and public statements and so forth. What is in it for Israel, as I would say? If we, let's say, were to do something with these 200, what could we get in return that we're not getting at the moment? People say that we got Hadar Goldin out now because there was a goodwill gesture to facilitate a deal on these people because he apparently was held in the same tunnel, in the same area. I don't know if that's true.
No, it turns out that wasn't true.
But that's what we were told anyway at the beginning. It's not true. But all I'm saying is the following. I think our government should pursue this and say, okay, you want something from us. What can we get from you? Now, from a right point of view, I don't understand logically. If these are armed Hamas fighters, right? And they are on our side of the line on the ceasefire, you say surrender. And if you don't surrender, we can fight and we can kill them because they're armed. They're not innocent civilians. If that's decided, that's an option that's being put on hold. And maybe we're waiting for the ceasefire to fall apart and then we could do it. I mean, theoretically, you could flood the tunnels and they can force them to leave, or you can put, smoke in the tunnels. There are all sorts of things you could do, and I'm sure we're preparing different options. But are they being kept alive because we think they can be used for leverage to get something else that we want?
But, Mark, Trump's plan, or Trump and Netanyahu's plan, you could say, the first phase, what goodwill gesture? There is this plan in place. And the plan says, first phase, all hostages are returned, period. Now, that hasn't happened. What do we need more deals with them? And that's why Israelis got so livid when they heard that maybe they're negotiating for Hadar Goldin's body about these terrorists. Why? We already negotiated.
But maybe it's something else. Maybe it's something else.
No, but now we hear that Trump is planning. Now, we don't know if this is actually happening. A military base, a very, $500 billion military base on the Israel side of the Gaza border to enforce or to monitor the ceasefire. Now, first of all, we haven't hit the second phase of the war, which is totally disarming Hamas. But yes, now it looks as though Gaza will be divided in two parts. They're talking about it like Germany, like East Germany, West Germany, or something. It's not a good comparison. And also, as long as you leave Hamas alive there in that place, it festers. That won't work. But what we also know now is there are no countries. There's a big problem of the day after, even if the plan is implemented. So everything is up in the air. But let me say, I would like to ask you this question. All the seven-front war that we were winning, and you could still say we won, seemed to be in some ways, maybe all of this peace is busting out all over, and Abraham Accords actually were headed for renewed war because Iran is threatening a surprise attack on us. It seems to be rebuilding its ballistic missile capability. Hezbollah in Lebanon, we had a ceasefire there, and the deal of the ceasefire was we will not fire unless we see Hezbollah activity in Lebanon, and the Lebanese army is going to guarantee that. But the Lebanese army failed and didn't do anything, and so we have been attacking Hezbollah targets. Hezbollah's response to that is, oh, okay, so we're not disarming because Israel is attacking us. So there's Hezbollah saying we're going to go for it. Then there's Syria. The Syrian president, Ashara, went to the White House and said, I might negotiate it with Israel, but it's got to get out of its buffer zone. Okay, that's Syria. Then we have the Houthis said, if Gaza flares up again, we're going to resume fighting. So and in Judea and Samaria, what some people call the West Bank, there's constant fighting going on. There's terrorist activity, serious terrorist activity, and infiltrations. And we've had sirens about terrorists infiltrating into Israel. So I'm asking you, with all of this that we were about to design, Trump's 20-point plan, are we headed back to war, regional war, or peace?
So I don't think we're heading for regional war. It's possible the Gaza ceasefire will fall apart. That's possible. And then if we have to return to firing, at least we're doing it we don't have to worry about live hostages being held by Hamas. I think we've said this on a previous episode. Israel will be freer to act against Hamas because we don't have to worry about accidentally, inadvertently killing an Israeli hostages. So I hope with the plan of Trump succeeds. I do know it could fail. And if it fails because Hamas refuses to do what it's supposed to do, which is disarm and stop governing Gaza, right? Then all bets are off. Then if Hamas doesn't fulfill what it's supposed to do under its commitments, then all bets are off. In the north, you're right, Hezbollah has refused to disarm. The Lebanese government is either too weak or is unwilling, or a combination of them both, to really push the envelope on this. And Israel has been acting ever since, according to the rules of engagement, since the ceasefire hit in. When we see an Hezbollah infringement, we attack and we hit. And I think that can continue almost indefinitely. If Hezbollah was to shoot back, though, I think Israel would immediately escalate. I think Israel would bomb Hezbollah targets in Beirut, the infamous, I should say, Dahya. And I think that's, like, anyone who thought there's going to be a perfect solution tomorrow, I mean, that's not realistic. But are we in a much better position than we were this time a year and a month ago? Of course we're in a much better position. Hezbollah is a shadow of its former self. It's still there. Given opportunity, it would rearm in this, so we have to keep our eyes on the ball. But the situation is much better. The situation in Syria is much better. So if you say, I had expectations that the new Middle East was about to break out and we're going to have peace and, love with all our neighbors, I'd say to you, well, that was unrealistic. But from a realistic expectation, where we were this time a year and a half ago and where we are now, no doubt the situation is much, much, much better. 1 minute we've got left. I want to say a word about Hadar Goldin, who was buried yesterday, the hostage who was held for 11 years. His family went through hell because 11 years is a long time to have a son who was killed in Gaza, and they were waiting for him to come back for burial. It was very difficult for the family. The parents spoke, I think, at the funeral. They did speak at the funeral, of course not. Very emotional. I think every Israeli could relate to that. But I want to tell you something, and you can disagree with me, Ruthie. Not the parents and not the siblings, but there was a friend of the family who spoke at the funeral, and he attacked the government, and he said he was told, but he was angry. He was told by a general that we're not going to start a war to get back a dead hostage. And this is not a strategic issue. And I want to say that the person, the general or the security official who said that, is 100% correct. Whether Israel goes to war or doesn't go to war, that's a very important decision. In war, we're going to lose people. And there's no war without casualties on our side. There's no war without risk. To go to war to get back a dead hostage, as much as it's maybe in Israel, it's not a nice thing to say today, yeah? But you don't go to war because they refuse to give back a dead. I think that's a bridge too far. As much as you want to support the families, as much you want to comfort families, as much as you want to do everything you can to bring back a dead hostage for burial in Israel, to say that's a reason to go for war, I think that's a bridge too far.
Right, but then let me just end, and one thing to say about the Goldin's parents, Hadar Goldin's parents. Over the years, one thing I have to say in fairness to them and in honor of them, and I also agreed with them, over the years they said, we don't want you to lose soldiers on behalf of our dead son, we have leverage, and we've been in Gaza. We've had at least 2 mini wars in Gaza since 2014. And then and since, and in 2021. And why did we leave? They were saying, and every time there were deals in Washington, Leah Goldin, Hadar's mother, was saying, why are you ending this? Why aren't you leveraging? Why aren't you forcing them to return his body, not go to war in order to retrieve him? Why are you not pressuring the UN and Washington? And also, you dictate to Hamas. For example, in 2021, we ended without demanding his release, his body.
It's more than that, because at the same time, you will recall, there were 2 live Israelis, an Ethiopian and a Bedouin. Should they have got priority over a dead soldier, even though he was a hero and he was a fighter, but he was dead, and you had 2 live Israelis there? In other words, I think a lot of the conversation, first of all, the family deserves our love and respect and support, and they went through hell. And I'm not judging the family, I'm judging the friend of the family who spoke at the funeral. I think that there are some things that people say, but it's just not logical. Are you really going to go to war? Like tomorrow, Hamas stops giving back hostages, all right? So they're breaking the agreement. But let's say they disarm. Let's say maybe they don't have all the hostages. Well, you have to think everything through. You don't just say, if we don't get what we want on every issue, you go to war. It's a much more complicated situation.
I totally agree with that. And now what we're going to say, I just would like to end by saying, if you ever thought that I had some fantasies about peace across the new Middle East, forget about it. That's not me. And yes, we're in a better situation. But what I'm saying is that this is what happens when you fight jihadists. And it's not like having a war between two countries that ends in a victory of this side and a defeat of that side. They just keep crawling out of the woodworks, and they just keep recruiting, and they just keep getting funded. And so we can never just say, okay, that war ended. That's the truth.
So we will continue this conversation next week. And until then, I wish you a good week, Ruthie.
Same here, Mark.